Excellent. I'm being told that we're live. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Atonal Symphonies, Conversations on Blackness and Aesthetics at the Threshold of Thinking and Making, which is presented by Liquid Blackness, Journal of Aesthetics and Black Studies. My name is Sampada Aranke. I'm the founding co-editor-in-chief of the journal and also of the research group that started the journal back in 2014. And I'm here with my co-conspirator and co-editor, Laura McLeod Kramer, and I'll give it over to her.
Hi, I'm Lauren McLeod Kramer. I want to begin today's session with two special acknowledgements. First, this event is being hosted by Liquid Blackness Research Group, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia. But from my home in Toronto, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. My second acknowledgement is for our generous sponsors. Thank you to the Department of Film and Media at Emory University. Atonal Symphonies is also supported by the Cinema Studies Institute and the Black Research Network at the University of Toronto, both of which have stood in solidarity with the censure, which I believe we have new news on today. But if you need more information about it, they both encourage you to visit censureuft.ca. To say more about the Black Research Network, I'd like to introduce you to its director, Dr. Beth Coleman.
Thanks, Lauren. I just want to say that Black Research Network is a strategic research initiative supported by the University of Toronto. So it's the first of its kind. And our work is to support Black excellence in research. But I would like to code that, particularly for this group and this gathering. Excellence is Black studies, Black life, Black techne, all the different parts. It's not just one thing. So I'm especially happy to have this as our first event that we're supporting. And thank you so much, Liquid Black, for the work that you guys are doing. It's quite incredible. And our formal launch will be October 8th. So after that, we will be reaching back out for international collaborators in our work. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Beth. I mean, we are just equally as excited and happy for the support. One final thing, I want to thank our participants who are contributors to issue 5.1 on liquidity, 5.2 on Blackness. And their work is helping us launch the journal as a space that we hope will be oriented towards certain values: the blurring of theory and practice, scholarly and creative work, institutional and non-institutional voices across seniority and generations, and our aspirational practice of Black study, and therefore our commitment to informality and improvisation, which we sampled abundantly last night, but hopefully in an energizing way. So I'll give it over to Jim Tobias, Associate Professor of English at University of Riverside, and Calvin Warren, Associate Professor of African American Studies at Emory. They will be moderating this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Alessandra, and welcome to everybody. I'm going to briefly just introduce the panelists, and then we'll just get started. I'm really excited to be part of this event, and I'm really appreciative of for everyone for sharing your work with us. So on today's panel, we had Kristin Juarez as part of the panel. Unfortunately, she can't make it this morning. And we also have Kevin Jerome Everson, Professor of Visual Art at University of Virginia, prolific filmmaker and artist. Creator of one of my favorite films, Cinnamon, from 2009. Cool. And his works obviously screen regularly at festivals, museums, and galleries. He's got 3 box sets available, as well as work available on streaming platforms. And his interview with Alessandra and Lauren appears in Liquid Blackness number 5.2. Also joining us today is Ekow Eshun, chairman of the Fourth Plinth Commissioning Group, author of the Orwell Prize nominated Africa State of Mind, Contemporary Photography Reimagines the Continent, and former director of the ICA London, and his essay on contemporary Black cinema appears in Liquid Blackness, number 5.1. Marina Peterson is also joining us this morning. She is Associate Professor of Anthropology at University of Texas, Austin. She's the author of Sound, Space, and the City, Civic Performance in Downtown Los Angeles. And this just happens to be a book I kind of keep close on my bookshelves. It's full of things that I'm interested in too. As well as other books and co-edited anthologies. Her essay, Moving Between Thinking Through Helium, also appears in Liquid Blackness 5.1. So I want to welcome everybody today. I want to thank you for your contributions. This is really kind of a celebration of the journal and a celebration of your work, which makes the journal. So really, hats off and thank you for being here, and thank you for your work. It's just really exciting to be able to read it all together at this point, and to have you here to talk about it with us. Calvin, anything you'd like to add or say about today's panel?
Yeah, I'd just like to echo everything that was said, and really thank you for these wonderful contributions. I think what's really exciting about the panel is the way that they are deconstructing binaries that have structured our way of thinking about art for so long in really gravid ways, deconstructing the abstract from the material, deconstructing the liquid from the solid. And so I'd really like to thank all of you for that. And perhaps we can open with just a statement with you talking about how liquidity has informed your artistic practice and your theoretical writing.
And yeah, why don't we just go around with everyone taking a turn and letting us know more about that. Maybe Kevin, would you like to start?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, for me, what liquidity and kind of in my practice is the ability to kind of shift subject matter, I guess, so to speak, and to embrace subject matter, and to make the work be about subject matter and not about the audience, and so to speak. So when I guess when I look through the viewfinder, so to speak, I'm looking at all the kind of the fluid movements of what the subject matter can do, and then also the kind of collaboration with me in the subject matter, so to speak. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for that. Marina, how do you think about that?
Let's see. So I'm mostly working at this point on sound and atmosphere, and in a kind of with a kind of materialist or a kind of attention or attunement, or an attention to the materiality, and more than that, the immateriality then of atmosphere and noise. So this was the focus of my book that just came out, Atmospheric Noise, Indefinite Urbanism in Los Angeles. And I was really grateful. I'm really grateful to Alessandra for giving me the opportunity to publish this piece on helium, and especially in conversation with Liquid Blackness more generally. So this piece on helium allowed me to explore, the kind of shifting form of matter that doesn't it doesn't stabilize, and is mostly atmospheric, but can become liquid. And then in our relationship with helium, among other kinds of material and immaterial forms, it really does a lot of work of, as Calvin, you suggested, destabilizing kind of differences and gaps, I guess, between the human bodies and the atmosphere, but more than that, even kind of destabilizing a humanism, right? So our human anthropocentrism, by thinking through matter in this way, or a kind of the immateriality of something that the the matter of something immaterial. So I'm thinking about, right now I'm writing about cloud seeding, which actually is more specifically about the liquid because it's, or seemingly so, but what I'm finding is that it isn't at all, that clouds are ice crystals that, may become raindrops and that there's this kind of, strange possibilities for human intervention. But I'm in this, I guess I'm picking up some of the pieces from the helium piece and thinking about the kind of the shifting forms of matter and what that does for, our understanding of what for destabilizing things, for keeping things in motion, right? And so, which I really appreciated both about Kevin and Ekow's work that in these, and the other issues. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ekow, how about yourself?
Yes, look, I suppose thinking about liquidity, I think what interests me in general is how to resist fixity. I think that feels salient in that most of the things I do tend to explore Black culture, Black cultural practice in one form or another. So right now I'm writing a couple of books and I'm curating exhibitions, and those exhibitions, the time frame of them is from, I've got one that opens in 2 weeks to one that opens in 3 years' time, and then various stages in between. What I'm interested in across that, I'm interested generally in the practice and the work of visual artists. I'm interested really overall in how one can explore articulations of Blackness that take us as far as possible from fixed notions of what Black is. I'm really interested in what Black is, but I'm also really resistant to singular notions or singular versions of that. So I'm always really heartened and inspired to see and to think about the ways to yet further expand and dissolve some of those things. So interesting in Liquid Blackness 5.1, and Alessandra talks to John Comfort, and when we think about John's work, this is nothing but an ongoing articulation, an ongoing resistance to notions of Blackness as point, as territory, as singular sensibility, as physical form that can be seen and known. This seems to me an important and inspiring way to proceed, not just with work, but with being. I'm very interested in how you can stay alive and make work and not have the things around us kind of crush us and try and keep us in a singular place. It's what keeps me going.
Thank you all for your comments on this. I just really want to point to some of Calvin's work at this point too, who I think I've just been reading your book over the summer. It has taken me a while, Calvin, to really get through it all, because it's so kind of probing, and you're not only kind of taking up similar ideas in some ways, and also drawing out farther some of the comments and observations from people like Saidiya Hartman or Orlando Patterson. But I would actually hope that maybe you can kind of jump in here with some of the comments about, I think your work is already in kind of dialogue with some of what we're hearing. Is there something you can add to this idea of liquidity and Blackness and avoiding fixity?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think, one thing that I can add, given everything that people have said, is what happens when thought lacks fixity. We often think of thinking as something as a kind of a epistemological structure that gives certainty. It's an infrastructure rather than a tidal wave. And if we think of thought as an infrastructure that is solid, that is certain, and that the philosophical tradition has been invested in building with the material of thought that gives it the most certainty, being time, space. What I really appreciate about everyone on the panel here is how, in their own way, they are dismantling the infrastructure of thinking so that it no longer has a foundation that encrusts over time. Rather, it is much more fluid, even at the risk of uncertainty. And so all of that is, in short, just to say that I think, in conversation with the artist and with the theorist here, what liquidity provides is a way of reimagining thought as it's been conceived in philosophy. It is no longer fixed. It is no longer rigid. It's no longer solid. It is something that ebbs and it flows, and it's in motion. So I think that's the beauty of Black thought is precisely that noetic exercise in motion. And from our last journal, I think that we've been riding that wave in a very triumphant way. So again, I'd like to thank all of you for your contributions.
Yeah, that's interesting because the whole idea of like, I was trying to think of like, where do I fit in like in the practice, so to speak, and I was thinking about the whole idea of like how like that I never, make everything kind of concrete, like leave things kind of open-ended, so to speak, and then also I like the kind of the griot storytelling where it can move, and it can change throughout time and stuff, and yeah, and I was thinking about that. Somebody just texted me, but the new film I'm working on is about Eddie Hazel, the guitarist, and then so for decades I thought that George Clinton told him his mom died, and then he played Maggot Brain. So I went with that narrative as opposed to the real narrative, where he told him to play like as if your mama died. So the whole idea of like kind of this kind of switching up, kind of changing things and stuff to almost fit to my little aesthetic kind of box, whatever. I mean, not even box, but kind of fluid kind of movement through way telling the story, so to speak, and then approaching subject matter. Yeah. Somebody wrote Eddie is the man. Is that for me? Yeah. So I was trying to figure out. Yeah, I remember it was funny. I was in a conversation one time with, somebody like, they always want like Black Americans to make like biopics and shit, which is cool, I guess, whatever. But so I said Eddie Hazel, and then the conversation was over. But I wanted to kind of make this thing anyway because it was just based on the whole idea of art, and then that's my main subject matter is the kind of visual arts in a weird way, and how everybody within every kind of system or structure or gesture or is making an art, so to speak. So I just thought my whole thing is just like, ever since my son passed away, I wanted art to kind of bring, I'm not a religious man, but the art to kind of resurrect, so to speak. And then so I just thought the Eddie Hazel story with the art was resurrecting his mom, like after he left the studio, his mom was alive. So then the whole idea of like these kind of narratives kind of just kind of changing, so to speak. And then, and then being okay with your own form of the narrative, so to speak. Yeah. So, yeah. And then I like the whole idea of like not being fixed, and then this kind of solid becomes this kind of liquid, kind of more fluid, whatever, a way how we can approach Blackness and the subject matter, so to speak. Yeah.
Along those lines, I really appreciate that. I wonder if each of you could say something about, I guess, then the paradox of form in artistic and theoretical practice. Kevin, with your artistic practice and fluid narrative, Marina, when you're talking about helium, and Ekow, when you're talking about, not having a fixed Africa, but Africa is now a kind of a fluid enterprise. I guess the question that I would have is, do you think that form is something that is possible? Is it an impossibility? Or does form take on new resonance now with its intrusion of liquidity? And anyone can start.
Absolutely. I think form takes on, yeah. I mean, it's got to. I mean, I don't know if it's got to. I mean, I'm not making an edict, whatever, but yeah, I think it does, yeah, so to speak, yeah.
I mean, I would say, look, I think that's a great question. In that, you know, speaking personally, my background, I started off working really as a journalist. I used to interview. Remember when I first started writing, I used to interview a lot of hip hop artists. That's what I did.
Remember that. Wow.
And that's great. But two things out of that. One, it's always interesting being around those people. You know, because you realize two things really. You realize that, you know, like Wu-Tang or any of these people, man, they're performers. I mean, it's obvious to say, but the distinction between their public face and themselves is so interesting because they're not very clear what the lines are very often. Then, you know, I remember talking to him or Method, they really don't know. But at the same time as that, these are artists and poets. And if we're talking about form, it's really interesting. Like one of the things I learned from that, just to stick with that for a moment, looking at hip hop artists, I found it really educative not to think about them as rappers, but to think about them as poets and to think about what we understand a poet to be, which is someone who's in connection with themselves, with a muse, whatever, however we describe it. The traditional version of a poet is someone who's very sensitive. These two are sensitive people, but their persona and their, you know, the public space they occupy doesn't necessarily allow for that. I'm really interested in how in that respect, they've worked within form to find a way to articulate the things that are difficult for them to do otherwise, to find ways to live that would be difficult for them otherwise. And that's not so much about braggadocio or machismo. It's actually about how, as a man, you find a way to get to emotion, to get to sensitivity. And that's a long way of saying that I spend a lot of time trying to unlearn how to write or how to think. To come to Marina's point and what you're writing about helium, Marina, it's a really useful way of understanding that things don't have to be fixed, that in the nature of writing, one doesn't have to stick to linearity. In the nature of filmmaking, one doesn't have to stick to a fixed frame of narrative or time or start point or end point or arc. These are things that I find enormously sustaining as principles. And I found it takes a long time to unlearn the idea that if you write, you begin and end. In fact, writing is just another form of potential exploration, discovery, openness, and so on. And those are, I think, tremendously invigorating and inspiring ideas. And they have their obvious relationships to subject matter, to how one might think about Blackness again in these terms as something that has not got a necessarily prescribed beginning, form, or origin, however much that's insisted upon by the world around us.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm also thinking about how to write how to find a writing form that is adequate to the subject, that is a moving subject. And so that is atmospheric, that is indeterminate, that uncertain, and that in that way absolutely veers from a kind of formal academic form that we've been trained in, right? But or even a kind of narrative form, I think, and without necessarily going to something, that then is presents itself as poetry proper. I mean, but nonetheless, somehow kind of tend to a shifting form of matter, which, right, in this case was helium, but I think also something like Blackness. And for me, it's congruent with my musical practice, which is improvisational and playing. So I play cello and make sounds and with cello. And so I was also really interested and excited by the music that in terms of crossing all of our work and the ways that sound and music and also and an attention to listening is coming out, and that listening as part of a process and a practice. And that shifts maybe a little bit, but I'd love to hear more from the others about how that's figuring both. I mean, I watched the film, Ekow, that you wrote about, and then Kevin watched your Sound That film, and both of those, I mean, the way that the kind of an attunement and sociabilities are coming together, right? That there's kind of collectives that are formed, but then through sound and especially through listening.
Well, that makes sense. You know, like reading your writing, I can see that. Like it comes from the way it's written. It's almost like comes from a musician. Yeah, of paying attention to the details, whatever, so to speak, and the details being important, whatever. Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Marina, that you bring up improvisation, because it's one of the things I think it was kind of on the back of my mind. I was thinking so much of what kind of brought me into writing about films like Passing Through was that the sound image relations weren't obviously sort of pointed to jazz and traditions of Black call and response and antiphony and so on and so forth, and really opposed to kind of classical Hollywood narrative structure or even new Hollywood narrative structure. And it kind of took me a while to just sort of be okay with saying a huge part of the point of this film, this is a classic film from 1976, I guess, part of the Black filmmaking tradition of Los Angeles. In Passing Through, it's the sound image relations are improvisatory. It is about flow. As Calvin just put it, it's not about the infrastructure, it's more about the tidal wave. That's a great sort of teaching point I'm gonna take away from this. Anyway, and I'm just kind of curious to know more about this emphasis on both materiality and improvisatory sort of openness. I don't know if it's worth touching on this, but I kind of, when we talked about fixity and problems of, the binary and so on and so forth, I wanted to definitely reference Calvin's work too, because he really breaks out what that sort of opens onto. That problem is, what he calls ontological terror. And I think that, that there's a flip side of this, and this is something in working with Liquid Blackness and going to many of the research meetings and the meetings that were necessary to setting up this journal and getting kind of recognition and support for it. There was a kind of constant concern that we were overemphasizing fluidity, openness, exploration, kind of positive, affirmative values of things like improvisation. And people often wondered, well, are you attending enough to the problem of capital's ability to liquidate and the historical tendencies of capital to apply violence systematically in those histories of chattel slavery, of Jim Crow, new Jim Crow. And I think that Calvin's work really kind of has given me almost a shorthand for thinking about that problem. And another version of this is what Fred Moten has kind of, in a phrase, given us this idea of consent not to being a single being. And I love that turn of phrase too, just because of the kind of multiple meanings that consent not, that kind of imperative of consent not, the way that kind of also opens up, doesn't avoid the analysis, the required analysis of violence, but also really kind of works on something else. And when I was reading Ekow's work and the way that you were kind of rethinking and revising some of Membe's comments, I had a sense that kind of maybe the way that you were working with this really difficult problem of opening up form and process while retaining a critical stance that's not based on fixity, right? I wondered, we know Membe as a post-colonial thinker, and I have the sense of what you're doing there is almost kind of taking a decolonial approach to some of the concerns that have been treated through post-colonial thought. I don't know if that resonates, but it seems like there's a kind of a deliberate step to take things a little bit forward in terms of the Africa as a geoaesthetic category.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, decolonial versus post-colonial. I think only in that it seems to me that there is more territory yet to be explored, and that in that respect, one can move beyond a grappling immediacy of, let's say, the post-colonial, and can take those words in themselves and find further meaning yet in them. So yes, Mbembe, talks about Africa as a body in motion. And I love that notion. I love that notion because it seems to me what he offers there as a way of reading back into the history of African countries, a sense of syncretism and of hybridity that goes to the heart of African identity and that runs back, whatever it is, however far we want to go back in time. So this is less to do with grappling with the post-colonial, more about an understanding or how we can find a fruitful engagement potentially with ways of reading and ways of looking at and drawing from ideas of Africanness. And for me, that's just, I find that personally useful as a way, because I want to try and find some other paradigms, some other ways of seeing when it comes to Africanness. This seems to me an important thing. I mean, it's not terribly different to when you talk about talking about consent not to be a single being, which is such a great phrase, which has at its heart exactly the same thing. Let's resist any notion that we know this thing. Let's resist the notion that we can stop exploring, that we can stop going through into this territory. Let's keep trying to find ways to revisit space and people and place and history and so on. That seems to be an interesting task.
I mean, I think that kind of makes me think a little bit of some of the ways that you work with the moving image and recorded sound, Kevin. And I was looking at Cinnamon again recently, and it really struck me. I mean, people have written about your work, pointing out the ways in which your work can be seen as offering a take on the Black archive, Black visual archive, really kind of positioning you kind of at least affiliated with, if not working in a documentary tradition in a way, if in a more complex way. And I felt that wasn't quite right. And at the same time, you yourself have said, you've kind of indicated you're not as much interested in narrative filmmaking, and yet your films kind of ask us to think narratively quite often, but they take away information that a Hollywood narrative would give us, or at least they don't bother to kind of give us that setup. I think you said something about how you avoid the setup too in your interview.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm getting at is thinking about, other ways of knowing and knowing that's not kind of predicated on fixity or, the infrastructural kind of undermining and limiting logistics of philosophy, as Calvin was putting it. The way you kind of work with the materiality of the image suggests, an interest in that. I mean, I think of like that, but I guess what I'm getting at is too, I was saying this to Alessandra the other day, you kind of make us sort of work to get at our narrative take on your work, but then you also kind of build in these messages for us. So for example, when the mechanic in Cinnamon says drag racing is all about consistency, like the whole project just kind of came together in that moment. I started thinking about your work in terms of consistency as in like the consistency of a material object or fluid, the kind of physical attributes of consistency, as well as the sort of the aesthetic need for consistency as we work over time to kind of find ourselves in our workflow. I don't know if that speaks to concerns that you're interested in.
Yeah, I mean, Cinnamon, the film James is referring to is about this African-American drag racing family. And for me, I always wanted to make a film about abstract expressionist painting. So the first thing I thought about was drag racing. Because it made sense to me, because it's what the layperson think it's easy, but there's complexity within it, so to speak. So that's why it has all that kind of stuff in it. But then, but my thing is, it's more about, the viewers got to catch up. The people on screen are intellectuals, right? And they're intellectualizing what they're doing. And so I'm, like I said, just, like in my little intro, I said, like, just when I'm looking through the viewfinder, I'm looking at the subject matter as it's kind of intellectual. And so I don't have to understand what the person is doing, but as long as they understand it, then it'll come across, and so I'll like construct it, like in now what Marina said, she saw Sound That. And so I didn't, I knew what these guys were doing, but I was like, there's beauty in it, and they're working hard. And so I just was kind of digging how they were, and then even constructing it even more abstract to the viewer, because what we were doing was we were looking, they were listening to things in Cleveland that had this past that only people from Cleveland and me knew about if you watch the film. But within it, there's other things that were going on, so to speak. So the audio of the kind of sound is that the viewer couldn't hear the past or the present, because these guys are listening to it, but the subject matter does, So that's the whole kind of strategy, is that it's between the subject matter and, I guess, the authorship or whatever, the artist, whatever, so to speak, So just when you apply paint to canvas, it's between the, like subject matter and the material. I mean, like the author and the materials, whatever. So that's how I kind of start to construct these things, whatever.
As massive as some of these interventions are, and I think they are kind of massive and it's super impressive, it's also just kind of refreshing to not have to put narrative in a box that's opposed to abstraction.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't know how to do it, whatever. I mean, it takes a certain kind of skill and shit. I don't have that. I don't know. It's like, whatever, I guess that's an option, I guess, so to speak, but it doesn't appeal to me, whatever, so to speak,
So in Cinnamon, the key figure, Erin, who's, drag racing, and she's, you present her as also working in a bank or something, as a mortgage broker?
Something, a bank teller. Yeah.
And, there's part of me, when the film ends, she's been seen a couple of times working with someone trying to get a loan.
Yeah.
And part of me at the end of the film is like, but did they get that loan? Which is like a total narrative kind of response,
Yeah.
And there's something in the way that you avoid the narrative structures of anticipation, of suspension, that always want us to like move from a setup to a conclusion.
Well, I mean, you're waiting on the wrong thing, you know. Like that's like, that's not important to me. I mean, it may be important. Yeah, I don't know. Like I figured, like
But it seems like a legitimate enough response that actually helps us kind of balance some of the demands to think more openly, to explore the sound image of drag racing. I love the idea of drag racing as a form of abstract expressionism.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm always trying to look for the form of what, no matter what the discipline is, there's like this kind of form, and then people in the discipline understand the varieties of those forms. And to me, that's fascinating, no matter what the discipline is, whatever, so to speak. So I just, go.
I'm so interested in that. It's interested in the interview that you did, and you talk about your relationship to abstractionists like Sam Gilliam and so on. I'm interested, is that for you, is that a relationship that you bring to the act of filmmaking, or is that something you also see in the people that you film? You talk about these films and the figures in them as intellectuals. Are they performing a form of abstraction themselves, or is this the lens that you apply to them? Is this to do with your practice?
Of course, I'd say more it's to do with my practice, because our interaction, that's my goal in a weird way. But I tell them that I'm doing like I just met with this butcher with maybe Tuesday or Wednesday, whatever. And I was like, yo, bro, I mean, I'm gonna make this thing abstract, And then, he was cutting bacon, so I was just like, and then, he was like, just whatever, just like cutting bacon, whatever, so I was like, all right, cool, so I just like informed him or what was about to happen in some form or another, whatever. But but I think it's more me, whatever. But then I think, with the way I position, like, the camera and the materialities, the lens or the film stock or the degree, of the lighting, whatever. I mean, it's going to like create something that only I'm kind of putting together. So it's more me than them, so to speak. But it's my conversation. But I do hip people to exactly what's about to happen, whatever. I mean, it's not like drastic, whatever, because they're going to be doing their thing, But then the whole idea of like, but the presentation of it is like it's trying to be that, whatever. It's trying to be that kind of like in those relationships to what I guess like art or abstract art, visual art is supposed to, or the language of these kind of disciplines, whatever, of art making. So yeah.
But then it's also, again, you describe them as intellectuals, you describe them as artists.
Totally.
So it's also more than just, I think what's so fascinating, it's also more than just a sort of honoring of them as craftspeople or
because they're always intellectualizing what they're doing, and then there's a skill set that takes to do all these things that nobody can just walk in there and do, right? You can't get in the car and start drag racing, and then you can't work for the city of Cleveland without having the proper knowledge of how these materials work, so to speak. So I think that's why I cut out Act One, because in the traditional like narrative or documentary, they're supposed to explain the history of this kind of shit, But for me, I'm just like, no. I mean, I just like how the viewer has to kind of catch up, whatever. And I got to catch up, because I'm learning on the job too as well. So I got to catch up. And then for me, it's not about informing the viewer or what they're doing, but it's to kind of for me to understand, for me to appreciate that they understand what they're doing, so to speak. So I think that's what I appreciate, especially in like sound that, because, we were just rolling, we were just like, these cats were just like looking for leaks. We had made it up at first. And then the next thing you know, like, oh man, this is a leak. And I was like, even better, whatever, so to speak, like, so we're going to work today, so everybody's going to work, so anyway, so I just like whole idea of like that kind of approach, but also too, I mean, the whole idea of like, I mean, I'm not trying to redo the kind of visual wrongs of like representational art since 1839, that kind of thing, or, since the Enlightenment period, whatever. But I think, you know, the whole idea of like, you know, when I see people who look like my relatives, you know, doing shit, you know, like doing stuff like that, then there's something, you know, like I don't like see that as foreign to me, but I think like the viewership see that as foreign. So the whole idea, you know, so the whole idea. I remember, you know, I made a film in Brazzaville, the Congo. And then it is funny because the films that I shot in the United States felt more foreign to the American audience than they did the film fucking Brazzaville because, you know, like they just think Black America lives in two different countries, you know, so it's, you know, like, yeah, but.
I mean, I think there's a way in which when I read Marina's work, I think of some of the kind of emergent tendencies in anthropology since the 90s, since kind of like all those questions about standpoint and situatedness and so on and so forth. And I really see your work as part of this kind of the new anthropology in a way. You correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm so curious about here is the way in which you know, a newer anthropology could be informed by aesthetic interests in intellectual practices. And I wonder if, like, is Kevin doing a kind of version of an aesthetic anthropology?
Or, I mean, I think it's very ethnographic, and I really want to learn more and watch more because I think I can learn a lot. I mean, I from what I've seen and what I've read, I can learn a lot from you. So I also so I've been the sound that really resonated because I was I've been teaching a sonic ethnography class that is about how people listen, and so really attending. So right, moving away from the ethnographer, the anthropologist listening to attend to how other people listening as a mode of ethnographic research. And so for me, that film does that so perfectly, right? To show, and so I emphasize also, right, that there's expertise in listening in all kinds of work and all kinds and everyday expertise, but also especially in labor of different kinds, right? So, I mean, and I see, I mean, I did some work on coal mining in Appalachia and also was in Ohio, but I love that the workers listening for the underground and listening for the water. It's so perfect, and that's their expertise, right? They're expert listeners, and then they're also organizing their work around that, and then really, you know, organizing the relationships, right, through that listening practice. So you see them, you know, talking about what they're hearing, and I didn't know that part. I mean, about what you were saying, that there's a notion of listening to a past of Cleveland that only you know or they know, which is, I mean, it's just beautiful. So yeah, so I really want to sit with that one more and work with that too, that piece. And in terms of being informed by aesthetic practices or artistic things, I think yes. So some of us, a lot of us, I mean, doing things called experimental ethnography that are, you know, working with other media as a way of doing ethnographic work. So, but also then kind of doing that in an experimental way. So and what that does for the ethnographic research itself, and what that does for the, you know, the subject matter, how that shifts what you're, you know, how you engage, and also how you treat subject matter. And also really these same questions about how do we treat abstraction, and how do we make something abstract when there has been such, I mean, maybe especially in social sciences, right, of representing something as, you know, in a particular kind of, you know, representational mode that kind of, right, that disallows a really actually something like abstraction, in fact, for most of the time. So yeah, I mean, there's some of us at UT talking about that a lot, some of the grad students and my colleagues, and we're running something called Bureau for Experimental Ethnography. So we're kind of actively asking these questions.
Well, yeah, I mean, I like the fact that, you know, depends on the subject matter, the form of the writing has to shift, whatever, so to speak, to either, you know, engage with the subject matter or invite readership or distract readership. It depends on the option. It depends on what you want to do, so to speak. Yeah. So. I think that's fascinating. Yeah. It's a great piece.
It's interesting. It seems like you all in your own way offer an ethnography of the senses, a geopolitics of the senses, that you all attend to the different senses, listening, sound, sight, touch in your own way. So I guess I had a general question. Is it your aim, your artistic and your theoretical agenda to decolonize the senses, or to reimagine what Blackness does to the senses? And if Blackness does something different to the senses, to sound, to sight, to touch and motion, what is the future of Blackness in the senses? Is art the way that the senses are reimagined? And do you see Blackness as presenting new possibilities for either a reconfiguration of the senses or just something completely different?
Well, I mean, I think in Echows, we're writing, idea of like being aware of these kind of relationships all over the diaspora, what you were writing about, these particular films. I think, just the senses of it, like being aware of there's other kind of forms, and people have these kind of set these relationships to each other in these different kind of landscapes and like interiorities and these exteriorities. Just being, I guess that's a way of being sensitive or to the senses, so to speak. Yeah.
It's interesting because my students struggle when I talk about aesthetic experience, because they're so used to not having a language for it. And also this idea that when someone tries to teach them about it, it's like a painting on a wall in a frame or something. Mm-hmm. And I really, at times struggle, but consistently work on getting them to rethink aesthetic experience. I think this idea of, art is the way the senses are reimagined or decolonized is really powerful. And I think it's actually kind of something that is a broad sort of need and impetus, especially across the academy right now, but clearly beyond. And I think you're making me really think about my own, my own teaching practice as well.
I think those are really interesting set of questions, Calvin. I'm writing a book at the moment, and it's kind of non-fiction and a few other things. And I've just finished a chapter about this guy called Matthew Henson, who's a kind of polar explorer who, is potentially the first, as black man, potentially first person to reach the North Pole, depending on how you read histories and so on.
Probably the sixth black man to reach the North Pole.
Sorry?
No, I said he's probably the sixth black man, not the first.
Yeah. And, one of the things that's interesting me about that is, well, look, we're in 1906. We're from the end of the 19th to the early 20th. It's kind of nations of sort of novelty, and black figure doesn't belong there in archetypal ways. And then I'm kind of interested in how you describe the strangeness of his position, both the strangeness of the polar north, but then the strangeness and the quote unquote illegitimacy of his social position, kind of being in this being this kind of extreme situation when further down south, just kind of advent of Jim Crow, all sorts of things going on simultaneously.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in how you do that, and then to come to Calvin's point, how you articulate some of that within the kind of the utter extraordinariness of this landscape, where sensibility, where sense comes in all sorts of ways. I think, Marina, you were saying that, clouds are these, kind of floating clusters of, ice crystals. So you kind of encounter these hybrid weather conditions the entire time. So well, I'm trying to do that, but but one of the things about that is you can't take that absolutely literally. You have to try and find a way to describe some of this rather than kind of didacticize it. You have to feel your way through, because the given is that any figure who's in that kind of landscape is doing no more than feeling their way. They don't really know where they're going physically, because how do you get in, all sorts of things. So yeah, it's a kind of salient question. And I think in an even larger sense, one of the things that fascinates me 100% of the time is just the strangeness of blackness as a condition anyway. And I think the necessity of recognizing blackness as a kind of extraordinary condition for all the different ways that we cite, or we can know, or that we might speculate. One's always suspicious of attempts to quotidian, linear, to say that the answer lies in necessarily absolute abstraction, but to recognize we're not on fixed ground.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, like, blackness is just, just that curiosity. I mean, that cat was like, you look at the North Star and it's like, how can I get closer to the North Star? With the history of like people going north, and it's like, I just go to the North Pole.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, like taking Black people back from Canada. So I was just like, well, maybe just keep on going, until like, I just, as like human curiosity, it's just like blackness is just curious. It's like, how can I push the forms and stuff, and then just, just keep going north, whatever. And it's almost like the point where I belong here too, whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's always about not.
Yeah. Uh-oh. I think I'm. Hello?
Yeah, you're.
I think we lost. Is it me?
No, Ekow is you're breaking up a little bit. There's some trembling.
That last point.
A little bit.
Okay. Well, just Karen with.
Oh man. I mean, everybody's breaking up with me. Oh no. Maybe it's just me.
So
I mean, thermoception is an amazing sense to think through, and which is right. So the sense of temperature, of experience of temperature, which I mean, for me, is really the one that I mean, this question of decolonizing the senses, it is absolutely putting the most pressure on senses as figured as a relationship between subject and object that divides the subject and object, right? So the kind of the 5 modern senses, and then I think sound falls into this a lot, because there's sound and hearing were so disarticulated for purposes of physics and other things, but thermoception, which is classified as a 6th sense with a lot of other 6th senses, which I think I was thinking the films you're writing about, Ekow, also, right? To think of also kind of the spiritual world, or the kind of fantasy world, or the kind of imaginaries, or how to be with deities, right? I mean, and also be alive, or I mean, that I watched the shorter film that you wrote about, but it was that's an amazing way to think about senses and blackness and liquidity. And also I was really taken with the Trembling Archive that Christina is working with.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So, and another way, right, to think of trembling as a sense, and what that does for a kind of bodily relationship with the world, and across different registers, right? It's bringing in so many different kinds of things and sensations and ways of being together, but also in the kind of what I was writing about in terms of the screaming, the sonic part of it, the utterances, the moans, and what can come out of trembling, and then also how this is also, right, destabilizing this kind of fixity of an archive, the classificatory, and seeming solidity of something which we of course all know is never that, right? It's all kinds of random things in a place, but gets sedimented. I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking though with the, this shifts a little bit, and maybe if somebody else wants to say something about, because the ice part of it, I was, so as the ice part of the polar, and I wonder what others think, and the ice of clouds, which, we don't really think about clouds as being ice crystals, but the ice, that aspect of liquidity, or of water at least, I mean, it is not actually articulated in the Liquid Blackness program as far as I was looking at it. I was kind of interested in thinking of, in wondering why that hadn't come in, and also, if that's right, if that, maybe it's, to me, I would move too quickly to water, but I think it's very, we all sort of move to water, I think, very quickly in thinking about liquidity and the liquid, but then that water freezes, and that water has this also protean form, that part of which is freezing and crystallizing. That what do we do with that? That kind of, how do we think crystallization? Also in relation to liquidity.
Is thinking crystallization another rearticulation of the question of form for you, or are they different questions?
To me, I was actually thinking about it more in terms of a kind of, that the veer away, or the resistance to crystallization maybe had to do with the resistance to objectification, or kind of reification, right? And so that would be the reason to kind of stay, to keep the liquid moving. But I think maybe there's also ways in which the crystallization tells us something, right? And I don't know if it has to do with form, because I'm also thinking of form as something fluid, and not necessarily as a.
Look, look, there were actually all sorts of quite resonant metaphors to do with ice. I think, look, within Blackness, the role of cool within Blackness is enormous. Yeah. The role of,
dope.
Exactly. The number of metaphors that use ice, drug terms, through to the kind of froideur of pose, of gesture, of refinement, of resistance. All of these things, I think, come into play. I was in a plane the other day, I was rewatching Black Panther, a film. I think it may even be one of the first times we're introduced to Chadwick Boseman, to Black Panther. His aide sidekick says something about don't freeze. And he says, I never freeze. Oh, and that's our introduction to him as a character. Yeah. Because sometimes this notion of ice freezing is described again as a sort of antithesis to Blackness, warmth, tropical, and that's certainly what's going on in that film. But more broadly, again, I think there's a desire to understand and own some of those properties to do with the glacial nature of ice, both in terms of form, but then in terms of, it's kind of slippery, shiny, reflect the surface, and on and on and on. So I would say there's a number of productive ways to think about ice in those terms. It's just the ice is more than just frozen water.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions coming up in the chat, and I think one of them, actually, Ekow, you just mentioned some of this. Lauren was saying how last night's panel spoke to the issue of black cool and was relating that to this notion of crystallization. And I've been thinking throughout this that there's just a whole bunch of interesting ways in which the question of style could be brought to bear on this. And I think that was kind of getting at some of that. I don't know if that's relevant to the work here, but I kind of think style could be important because style and stylistics are actually really kind of material kind of engagements. And I feel like so much of this work matters so much because people are kind of being open-ended and creative with taking metaphors seriously and in a materialistic way. But they're also trying to get past metaphor to talk about matter in a way that that kind of ideological approaches have been kind of found themselves to be limited in. So I wonder if style and that question of Black cool as a kind of materialist style has something to say there. Another comment that came up here is saying that Terry Francis, the archive isn't super fixed though. It's a place where stories get changed and you never get
Absolutely.
what, yeah. And so the archive has a precarity. I remember this kind of term that I struggled with in Archive Fever, Derrida's book Archive Fever, which I think for a while helped people think about some of those issues around the archive in an interesting way. But he had this term, I think it's archiviolithic and anti-archiviolithic, something like that. It has to do with, like, lithic means stone, right? And this idea of the archive as kind of set in stone. And what he was trying to get at was, like, there's a way in which the archive also kind of depends on, or at least experiences, a sort of death drive. Like there's a kind of destructive force that we always sort of find working through any kind of archival formulation or formation. And I think that part of this idea of the archive's precarity and its fluidity or liquidity also has to do with that idea of, something like, an archive too has, or experiences or opens up to something like a destructive force, or at least an anti-fixing type of force too.
I'm reminded of when I was a kid, my great grandmother used to freeze all of this meat, and she'd have this huge freezer. And
Damn right.
And I would think to myself, like, that's so odd, but like, why is she freezing all this meat? And thinking about your question about crystallization, I'm realizing that preservation through freezing has been such a part of African American culture, or Black culture in general. And when you speak about ice, I think about it as a metaphor of the way Blackness preserves its life-affirming functions, in the way that great grandmothers know to freeze meat in order to preserve it. So I wonder if you could speak to the ways that artistic practice and theoretical practice freezes Blackness in a way that freezing means here to preserve, to protect, to provide a situation or a condition for potentiality. Because once you take something out of the freezer, the potential that was wrapped inside of it is now accessible. So I'm wondering if that's helpful or not at all to think about freezing and ice as preservation. And if it is helpful, how might that inform your practice?
I guess yes. I don't know if that's a question or not. The simple answer is yeah. I mean, I don't know. I guess, it's always changing. So, you can't, it's, I don't know if it's protected or not, but it's, yeah, I don't know.
I tell you what, I want to go back to, maybe this is a way to link a couple of things that, James, you were talking about style as a territory. And I was thinking, I think one of the things that I find very valuable in Kevin's films, this capturing of life, of gesture, of language, all of these things that are of specialism and expertise, this description of these figures as intellectuals and artists, this holding to these things as valuable, as worth exploring. And I think sometimes we think about style as overt gesture, as something that sits on top of something authentic or something interior. I think with Blackness, we're talking about these things. I think part of that is, well, again, it's a sort of long established thing. You can go back to Zora Neale Hurston or anyone else. This thing about how to hold on to, how to capture the everyday and understand that there's an articulation of being and of possibility, and therefore also of poetry. And I think if we want to talk about, holding something and preserving something, then these are means of doing the same thing. It's not about holding it in ice. It's about recognizing there's a value in capturing that, in holding that, so that it can continue to breathe, so that we can continue to enjoy that thing and recognize and honor that thing.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. You know, I'm always hesitant to bring up the issue of style because it's so often treated as exactly like you said, a kind of something that sits on top or that's sort of extracted from, you know, the surface or something. And style and stylistics as a kind of study is obviously kind of materialist in a way. Like we want to know how it is that like beyond just learning, beyond self-presentation, beyond collective formation, style has to do with essentially formation, preservation, invention of culture, right? And I always go back to Octavio Paz. I have this like phrase in my head that, and from one of his books, I think it's The Critique of the Pyramid or something like that. And he has this nice line. He says, civilization, styles of living, styles of dying. And I think for me, that's kind of how I fundamentally think about style. It really has to do with kind of coming into the world and moving out of the world, or living with worlds that have gone out too. But yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really helpful and beautifully put.
But I like the play with gesture, because that gesture is both reproducing something, and that there's something that is carried and shared, but then also gesture is minor, right? A gesture is, I mean, it's a turn of a hand, it's a turning your ear and listening. It's a, the movement of dancing without necessarily having it be a style, right? But then that style can maybe it is crystallized, I guess, in gestures and shared and circulated in that way, but also in a way that changes, right? So it's not that gesture does a kind of a different kind of less a kind of a work that's a little bit under the surface, right? A little bit that isn't that, again, minor, that isn't kind of making an announcement of itself necessarily.
I mean, again, you know, move to music for a moment. Toni Morrison talks about she talked about how she, you know, she strove to write with the fluidity or the possibility of Black music. And I've always thought that's such a kind of wonderful way of thinking about this, because you know, so much we talk about these things, and obviously it's about kind of the reaching is really towards the kind of tonalities that you can get to in music, and that exist almost nowhere else with that kind of crystallized quality. I think many other art forms, and I guess this is the point she was making, strive to be as precise as music can be in conveying texture and form and delicacy, all sorts of things. So I guess I kind of moved from thinking about style to thinking about music as a way to articulate gesture, as a way to articulate form, as a way to articulate dress even. In that style isn't just about a visual expression. Style is really, it's about how you talk about sensibility. And I think it remains one of the aspects of Black culture, Black cultural practice, Black identity, because we're always trying to find those ways to assert and insist on our being, because we know if we don't do that, someone is going to either put us in a corner or try and kill us or various things. So these things, they become quite important. So style as dress becomes important, but listening to music becomes really critical, because through that, I think it's just another way that one finds towards an affirmation of the self, because you recognize yourself through the tonalities of a song, potentially.
Yeah, and if, as Calvin said, part of the work here is decolonizing the senses, then the ways or the modalities or the media that we use to talk about sensibility becomes absolutely kind of crucial and not extra. And I think it helps explain the importance, or at least it helps us sort of speak to and value the importance of music and musicality, and not only kind of, for the art world or the academics, but in popular culture. I think, it gets back to what you were saying, Ekow, in terms of the way that hip hop musicians actually negotiate public and private. That's actually kind of, and if they're doing it in terms of musical performance, right? This is actually a sort of really kind of crucial and beautiful way of thinking about style and about thinking about decolonizing the senses.
Mm.
I hear kids.
Oh, that's me, I think. So
yeah.
That daughter and her friend.
I love it. It just feels like life. Yeah. That's good. Yeah.
I wanted to say there's a lot that was happening in the chat for a few minutes there, and if you have a chance to look at the chat, we're kind of heading into a kind of open-ended flowing Q&A along with this chat channel here. So I don't know if there's things there that people want to respond to or take up or throw back to.
Don't mind us. Look at Terry Francis down in Miami holding it down.
One interesting thing here in the chats is the conversation about bugs in the relation to the archive. That bugs, it seems, is a way of talking about the intrusive force of consumption in the practice of preservation. So I guess what I would ask is, how does consumption work here in your enterprises? Is consumption something that you're concerned about? Is consumption something that allows your artistic and theoretical practice to open up, or is it a kind of intrusive force that the theorist and the artist must guard against? If I'm understanding the chats correctly.
I mean, I would say consumption is context. We don't live outside capitalist environment. To go broader than that, Blackness doesn't live outside that. Blackness doesn't live outside a predatory condition, a condition that's trying to extract from it its iterative forms. The response, resistance, answer, proposal in relation to that, I don't think you can deny that, because it's our world, but the sustaining force is that there's always something new. The fascinating thing about Black culture is that it will always find some other form, some form that might be discrepant, might be abstract, might be avant-garde, might be radically popular, all sorts of things. And partly that bent towards invention and innovation is to, to stay ahead of commodification. But another way to read commodification, or whatever we describe it as, again, one of the disturbing, sustaining, and troubling things is Black culture is life and death most of the time. Or let's say Black culture takes place against the context of anti-Blackness, of possibilities of dehumanization. So again, there's an importance, there's an imperative towards invention, because this is about keeping moving. This is about consenting not to be a single being. This is about liquidity. This is about, to go back to Public Enemy, not having a target on your head. This is about how you stay alive.
Would anyone else like to respond to the urgency of art in this way? The kind of the staying alive aspect of it. Is that something that keeps you going as an artist, as a theorist, as an ethnographer? Is it something that you feel that your artistic and intellectual practice intervenes in or documents?
I don't know. I mean, that's harsh. Life or death. Like I'm trying not to think about it. I mean, I'm always around. I mean, I'm around too much of that outside of the artistic practice anyway. So I'm trying not to, sometimes bring it in. But I mean, the whole idea of, I guess, like, being, I don't know, like being seen, but being heard. Being in this kind of certain kind of conversation. I think, it could be. Part of it, whatever, yeah. But just keeping that going, the whole idea of keeping, or like keeping it moving, KIM, right? You want to keep it moving, yeah. I'm trying to think of it. I mean, something gets me up to make art. I think it's more kind of exploring these kind of formal qualities and stuff and understanding. For me, it's the ability to for me to keep understanding, to keep learning, to keep growing as an individual, so to speak. So I guess that is life or death. I guess I wasn't moving, I'd be like, I don't know, be sick or something. Like I don't know, whatever. Yeah, but yeah.
So it is getting close to the time that we are being asked to wrap up. And I'd just like to, turn it kind of back over to our panelists and ask for some final thoughts if you care to share any. But before that, I would like to thank everybody. Obviously, first of all, this has been a lovely conversation. And part of it for me is that I think it is, helping us to continue to engage and find ways to hopefully cherish and nourish Blackness in the academy. For those of us in the public research institution with diverse student bodies, these conversations are more important than ever. And I will certainly take away much of what you've shared with me today and share it with my students as well. So I want to thank you for that engagement and for that generosity. And at that point, I will mute and turn it over to the rest of the panel to give us some closing thoughts. And thanks to Alessandra and Lauren as well for everything.
think I want to just echo what Kevin just said, which was being seen, heard, and being in a certain conversation, and how wonderful this has been, and how I think, wonderful Liquid Blackness in general, but to activate the journal in this way with a conversation, with these conversations, is really remarkable. And I don't think I couldn't have imagined it necessarily. And I think, Alessandra, this is really, and Lauren, this is a wonderful thing that you've done. And so thank you.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah, I just want to perhaps finishing thoughts again. We wanna be very clear of how grateful we are. It's very difficult to manifest. It's very difficult to fully express, but this is true. You are the Liquid Blackness Journal. The Liquid Blackness Journal depends on you, and creating these spaces, and these spaces work only when you make them work. So we're very grateful. And unless Lauren has anything to say, some of us are reconvening for another panel at 2 p.m., 2 to 3 p.m. And then the last one is going to be at 5. And thank you so much. I think we can stop live streaming.
All right. Thanks. Right on.